Darren, I've seen that you've joined us. Are you available on audio as well? We can test your phone real fast. Darren, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
Awesome. Great. We have everyone on. I'm going to start the webinar. All right. Good morning, everyone. We've just started the webinar. We're going to give folks a few moments to log in. Thank you so much for joining us. We do have folks who are joining us remotely using our Zoom webcast, and others are dialing in or listening in through our EPA live webcast. So thank you so much for joining us. Let's give folks a few more minutes. Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Appold. I'm the senior for the Needs Analysis Unit, and we're so happy to have you with us here today. This is our fourth webinar, or our third webinar. I'm getting lost in all of the webinars we're doing, but the third webinar that we have on our cost assessment model. We are going to be giving you all an update on where we are with the development of that model, and provide an overview of the methodology that will be employed in our gap analysis, which is the last step of the cost assessment model. Before we get in, we're going to go over some meeting logistics. Just wanted to remind folks, this is the Water Board. We have our mission to preserve, enhance, and restore the water quality in California, to protect it for the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses. And you are listening to folks who have all been working on the SAFER program, which is a new initiative at the Water Board. And we'll be providing some more background information in just a little bit on the SAFER program. But today, what are we going to cover? We're going to discuss, again, what is the needs assessment, which is the overarching effort that the cost assessment is under. We're going to focus today on giving you an update on the cost assessment model, in particular, the sustainability and resiliency assessment piece of that model, how the model is going to be selecting modeled solutions so that we can roll up estimated costs statewide. And then we're going to dive in deep and provide an overview of the funding gap analysis methodology that's going to be employed at the very end of the cost assessment. And then we'll provide some next steps and a timeline. Again, I'm Kristen Appold, and I'm going to be providing some introductions today and just a high-level overview. But before we get into it, I just want to help people understand how they can participate. We really want to hear from you, and so we've got a number of options. There are folks who can watch us live right now on our Cal EPA webpage. So if you run into any issues with Zoom, you can hop over to our website and watch the live webcast there. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like us to read out loud or address during this webinar or after the webinar, I really encourage you to email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov, and we'll respond as soon as we can. We do have folks monitoring that email account right now. For those of you who are participating via Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to submit questions that we can address throughout the webinar. And those who are monitoring the Q&A section, if you see a question that someone else has submitted, you can upvote that question, give it a little thumbs up if it's a question that you also have and would really like to see addressed during this webinar. You also have the option to raise your hand during the Q&A sessions, and we can call on you and we'll ask you to unmute yourself. And you can ask a question to the panelists or water board staff on this webinar as well. We do ask that you identify yourself, your name and your organization. If you're representing an organization, that would be very helpful. So before we get started, we just have 2 quick poll questions that we wanted to ask you, and let me launch the first one. First one is, have you participated in any of the last 2 webinar workshops that we've hosted on the cost assessment model? It's good to know if we have folks who are familiar with the model compared to those where maybe this is the first time you've heard about it, so we know how much background information we should be providing. Okay. Just a few more seconds. All right, let's see. Share the results. It looks like the majority of you, 63%, have participated in our previous webinars, which is fantastic. We're so happy to have you join us again. And then we've got some newbies. We're so glad that you guys are joining us. We hope that you are able to follow along today. We're going to be providing enough background information, so hopefully it makes sense what we're covering. But if you have any clarifying questions, please feel free to submit a Q&A or a question through the question box. Raise your hand. We're happy to dive in with you. Okay, stop sharing. And then we're going to launch poll 2, which is asking, have you read the white paper on the gap analysis for funding solutions? This is a white paper that we just recently published this week. We did share it with folks who had registered by yesterday morning. So if you've registered since then, maybe you haven't seen it yet, and that's okay. You do not need to have read the paper to follow along today, but we do encourage everyone to take a look at it. We can email you a copy, or if you visit our needs assessment website, you can download it there as well. And we'll be sharing these slides with folks who have registered, and there will be a hyperlink to the paper in the slide deck as well. Okay, ending the poll, sharing the results. Majority of you have not read it, which is totally fine, but a few of you have, which is fantastic, and only 1 person does not intend to read it, and that's okay. Hopefully the slides that we have today will cover the content that you're interested in. Okay. So why are we here today? You know, we passed, or the California legislature passed Senate Bill 200 just a few years ago to create the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. It's a really amazing new source of funding that the Water Board has that provides up to $130 million a year through 2030 to help communities in need. The language in SB 200 is specific in saying that the fund expenditure plan, which helps prioritize how that funding is spent, should be based on something called the needs assessment. What exactly is the needs assessment? We like to say that the needs assessment is composed of 3 core components. There's an affordability assessment, there's a risk assessment, and there's a cost assessment. And there's a lot of folks who've been following along our other webinars. We've really been digging deep on how to develop the risk assessment methodology for public water systems. And we've been working with a lot of partners too on our cost assessment work. The cost assessment is really looking at our at-risk systems, which are identified by the risk assessment, and then our systems that are failing, that are on our human right to water list. And it's trying to estimate how much would it cost the state to address the challenges and issues that these systems are facing, to really put a price tag on it so that the Water Board has an idea on how it should be budgeting and planning for the future. The results of the full needs assessment and the risk assessment really is about helping with prioritization. We know, and you'll see later how we're going to be estimating this, but we don't anticipate having enough funding to meet all of the demand that we believe is out there. So we use the results of the needs assessment to help us prioritize where funding and technical assistance should be targeted. The priority is going to be those systems that are currently out of compliance or are on our human right to water list that are failing. The second priority are those at-risk or potentially at-risk systems. And then at the bottom are the ones that are not on our failing list and are also not at risk. The way that everything kind of loops together at the water board is that we have our annual needs assessment, which then helps inform the annual and fund expenditure plan, which then helps with prioritization. And then you may have heard about the SAFER programs, engagement units, and all of the work that we're doing to help local communities access funding, technical assistance, and solutions. Those engagement units, again, are using the results of our prioritization to help target where their efforts are focused. So we have had 2 webinars already on the cost assessment model development, and a lot of great public feedback has come in to help us refine our model. There is a white paper that was published back in November that really dives in deep on all of the different components of the cost model, where the cost estimates are coming from, how it's all being baked in, and we do encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in more. The white paper that we published for this webinar is really focused on the gap analysis and less so on the cost assessment model piece. So if you'd like to see the cost assessment model methodology write-up, please take a look at the November white paper, and the link is provided in the slides here. We'll be going over the process in just a little bit with Corona Environmental, which has been helping us develop the cost assessment model. But for those who have participated in previous webinars, this infographic should look familiar to you. We have a multi-step process for human right to water systems on how we are trying to evaluate the high-level statewide cost of addressing their issues. And today we're really going to be focusing in on the second half of the model, which is we've already identified the systems, we've already identified what the modeled solutions for those systems might be, but how do we select the best one? And so we'll be going over the criteria on how those modeled solutions will be selected, and then how they're going to be aggregated statewide so that we can do a funding gap analysis. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tara with Corona Environmental, who's going to give you an update on the cost assessment model. Tara?
Great, thank you so much. So we did present last in November of 2020, and we just want to give you a couple of updates and refinements that we've made to the cost model. Some were in response to comments we received, and others were just kind of as we worked through the process, realizing that the at-risk systems really needed to be handled differently than the human right to water systems. So we'll go through the process a little more for at-risk systems, just to give you an update on how we've modified our thinking there. And then there's a refinement of the sustainability and resiliency assessment, which was called Step 4A in our last presentation for the human right to water systems. And Khalil with Sac State will really be diving into the details of the sustainability and resiliency assessment. That's the step that we really are selecting the proposed modeled solution. And these are not real solutions for water systems. It's a model for budgetary purposes. Real systems would need to go through a full evaluation to understand their unique situations prior to coming up with a solution. This is only for budgetary purposes. Next slide, please. So this is the new process flow diagram. Previously in our slides, you had actually seen the piece on the left with kind of the red starting part there, the brick red color at the top, identification of failing systems. That really now applies to the human right to water systems. And we have many of the same steps in the at-risk systems, but a somewhat pared down process because we don't have as much data really on those systems. So it's more a budgetary placeholder, and we went through fewer number of steps really in selecting the budgetary amount that we would put in just as a placeholder for these types of systems. So the human right to water systems are still very much going through a very similar process to what we had described back in November and August. And now the at-risk systems are shown in that orange color there at the top. And there are a couple of groups of at-risk systems. There are the at-risk public water systems, and those were identified through the at-risk process, which there have been several webinars about, and that process will continue to get refined as the SAFER group moves forward with future needs assessments and refinements of the process. And then we have this other group, which is the at-risk state small water systems and domestic wells. And we have no actual water quality data for those systems in most cases. So that was all done using modeled water quality from the Gamma group. So, that's really a huge data gap for us that would need to be filled in the future, that those systems would actually need to have samples collected and those wells would need to have samples collected to figure out what their real water quality issues are. So this is a placeholder for those systems that we, and the wells that we think may have bigger issues than other places in the state. So the first step is just identification of the at-risk public water systems, going through the identified possible modeled solutions. And really the main analysis there was, can the water system be physically consolidated? Meaning, could it possibly connect to a bigger water system? And for the public water systems, we just looked at it, as a straight joining and receiving system analysis. For the smaller water systems, we really looked at it more as, can it be picked up as a regional consolidation? So there are some differences there in how they were evaluated. We developed the cost estimates for physical consolidation where possible, and we developed other infrastructure needs for all of those systems that are on the at-risk public water system list. And other infrastructure needs are things like additional storage, tanks, like that, meters, if they didn't have those, and also additional wells if they only had one well, replacement infrastructure for infrastructure that's aging. And that is just applied overall to the at-risk public water systems, not on an individual system basis. We used percentages based on a Kern County assessment that we did looking at the human right to water systems in Kern County. Then we take those costs and roll them up into a cost estimate, which is an aggregate estimate from the modeled systems. So again, this is just a placeholder budgetary number. It is not intended to indicate or dictate at all to any one system what their solution should be. Then next it will go to the funding gap analysis process. And you're going to hear a lot more about that in this presentation. Next slide. So getting into the cost assessment model process for at-risk state small water systems and domestic wells, the identification of those systems was really done, as I mentioned, through that modeled process where we looked at the Gamma water quality and matched it up with the locations of those state small water systems and domestic wells. And any of the areas that are associated with water quality that's at or above an MCL for a group of compounds, the modeled compounds. It's not every analyte in the universe, it's only 6 that they modeled. So that's kind of the limit of that analysis at the moment. Then we looked at if it's possible to do physical consolidation. And in this case, we really have to look much more carefully about, is it economically feasible to physically consolidate? It doesn't make sense to run a 1-mile pipeline to pick up one domestic well. So it would really have to be considered part of a regional solution. So that was the next step in the physical consolidation analysis, is can it be picked up in a bigger consolidation? So that's cost effective. And then the UCLA team also looked at point of use and point of entry or bottled water as an interim solution while we're waiting to sort of enact all of these other longer term solutions that can take quite a while. We developed the cost estimates for the physical consolidation where possible. And then it went into the rolled up cost estimate and the funding gap analysis, which you'll hear more about today. Next slide.
Thanks, Tara. We're going to turn things over to Khalil with Sac State, and they're going to go over the sustainability and resiliency step of our cost model. Khalil?
Yeah. Thank you, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. I'm Khalil Lazaik, and I'm a research engineer with the Office of Water Programs at Sacramento State. And I'm part of the team that's been working on developing the sustainability and resiliency assessment as part of the cost assessment model. And what I would like to do today is update you on the progress that we've made in developing the sustainability and resiliency assessment. In the previous State Water Board webcast that took place last November of 2020, I had covered the initial stages of the assessment's development, which focused primarily on how we selected the sustainability metrics that are now part of our assessment. And so if anyone is interested in those details, please refer back to that webcast and the white paper that was released with it. For today's presentation, I'll be providing a high-level update on the later stages of the assessment's methodology, that we have been working on since November. And then I'll proceed to follow that with an overview of how the cost assessment model selected solutions for systems based on their sustainability scores and their the developed solution cost estimates. Actually, Kristen, do you mind going back to the previous slide just for a sec? Thank you. Before delving into the details, as a refresher, let's remind ourselves of the context of the sustainability and resiliency assessment within the cost assessment model. The assessment evaluates the long-term sustainability and resiliency of modeled solutions, and we use a multi-criteria analysis that individually assesses a solution's resiliency through multiple non-cost related metrics that reflect issues such as technical performance and environmental sustainability. And for people who are asking, what's the purpose of the sustainability and resiliency assessment under step 4A when we have developed cost estimates for possible solutions under step 4B? Next slide, please. Well, cost is a central and important consideration, but sometimes the lowest cost model might not be the best long-term solution for a system. And there are other factors outside of cost that can meaningfully evaluate what the best modeled solution could be for a system. And so we think it's important that the cost assessment model also incorporates an assessment of resiliency and sustainability that looks at these modeled solutions from a non-cost perspective. I would like to note that the sustainability and resiliency assessment is not intended for site-specific decisions on which modeled solutions will be implemented on the ground. Rather, the objective of the assessment is to offer a broad level evaluation of solution feasibility and efficiency in the long term. Next slide, please. So let's get started by going through a list of the metrics that constitute the sustainability and resiliency assessment. Again, if you're interested in the selection process, again, refer back to the November 28th webinar and the white paper that was released with it. The following 4 metrics that you're seeing on the screen, again, they constitute our assessment, and they are the criteria against which modeled solutions are evaluated and assigned a score as a measure of resiliency and sustainability. The first metric is O&M costs per connection. This metric is a measure of a solution's affordability and refers to the O&M costs of cost estimates of a solution divided by the number of service connections in a water system. The second metric is relative operational difficulty. This metric is a measure of a solution's technical performance, and it refers to the technical complexity of treating water to comply with water quality standards. And it's a function of the number and complexity of treatment processes involved. The third metric is, excuse me, the operator training requirement. This metric is also an additional assessment of a solution's technical performance. And in this case, it refers to the grade level certification that's required to operate a treatment and distribution system. And the score of this metric is dependent on the contaminant type and also on the processes that are involved in it. And finally, we have waste stream generation, which is a measure of a solution's environmental sustainability. And it refers to the difficulty of managing the residual byproducts that are created by a treatment solution. And this depends on numerous factors, such as whether a waste stream is generated in the first place, the type of waste stream, but also the properties of the residuals being produced. Next slide, please. So after selecting the metrics for the assessment, the final selection, the next major methodological step was to develop metric-specific scoring rubrics, such as the one that you're seeing in front of you, that would be used to assign scores to potential modeled solutions. Every metric of the 4 that I had just shown you has a unique scoring rubric that was developed through an iterative and consultative process between the different water professionals and the project teams involved in this effort. These scoring rubrics were developed not only to assign the scores to the modeled solutions, but also to justify those score assignments as informed by the technical expertise and judgment of those involved in developing them. So let's examine what we have in front of us on the screen. What you're seeing is an example of one of the scoring rubrics. In this case, it's for the waste stream generation metric. And what the rubric is showing you is a list of the potential modeled solutions along with their assigned scores. And as you can see, these scores are ordinal scores that can range from 1 to 5, with lower scores indicating lower sustainability and resiliency and higher scores indicating higher sustainability and resiliency. And the scoring scheme applies to the rest of the metrics. So all the other metric rubrics will also have a scoring range from 1 to 5, again, 5 indicating better sustainability and 1 indicating lower sustainability. In the right column, the rubric provides justifications for the scores, and also it's a legend for what these scores mean. So for example, if you have a solution that doesn't produce a waste stream, in this metric it's assigned a high score of 5, as opposed to a solution that involves multiple treatment technologies that produce multiple waste streams. In that case, we'd give it a low score of 1. And then you have everything in between. So a lot, if not, not all, but a lot of the wellhead treatments have a score of 3 because they tend to produce a waste stream that is either hazardous or requires special disposal considerations. And again, so this is one rubric. Each of the other metrics would have their own unique rubric that goes through its own kind of analytical framework. And I think we can move to the next slide. So let's demonstrate how this works with a couple of study cases. Here we have study case A, water system A, with an arsenic violation. And in this system, we have 3 potential modeled solutions. We have physical consolidation, point of use, reverse osmosis, and arsenic wellhead treatment. And as you can see in the columns, each of the modeled solutions is assessed vis-a-vis each of the 4 metrics, and a score is assigned accordingly. And then to the most right-hand side of column, we calculated total sustainability and resiliency score by adding all these metric scores for a given solution. And so in this case, physical consolidation is evaluated as being the most resilient and sustainable solution with a high score of 20. Alternatively, POU is assessed as being least resilient and sustainable with a total score of 9.5 over 20. And then you have arsenic wellhead treatment, which marginally does a bit better than POU. Next slide. We have another study case here. It's a water system B. In this case, you have 2 analyte violations, nitrate and fluoride. And in this case, we only have 2 possible model solutions. It's either a point of use or fluoride wellhead treatment coupled with nitrate wellhead treatment. And in this case, POU is evaluated as being the most resilient and sustainable solution with a score out of 12 relative to the nitrate wellhead treatment and fluoride wellhead treatment alternative with a score of 4.5 over 20. Next slide. And so up to this point, we've laid out how the sustainability assessment evaluates the resiliency of potential modeled solutions, and we've presented a couple of study cases to show how it all works. So after solution cost estimates are developed under step 4B, and after the sustainability and resiliency of those solutions are evaluated under step 4A, the next step in the cost assessment model is selecting the best possible solution for each system based on both step 4A and 4B. Next slide, please. So again, the final modeled solution is going to be a function of the developed cost estimates and the long-term sustainability and resiliency evaluation scores. Before I proceed, though, I would like to highlight and emphasize that the selected model solutions are only for the purpose of the cost assessment and for budgetary purposes. And also that the selected solutions under step 5 do not dictate the solution that a community should pursue to achieve compliance and long-term sustainability. Next slide. Thank you. So to select the final modeled solution or the best modeled solution for a system under step 5, we developed a cost assessment model decision tree that uses a conditional if-then approach to make decisions on which solution to select for a system. The complete decision tree is presented on the left side of the slide in front of you. However, to make it easier and in order to make it easier to show and describe what is happening in the decision tree, and also to make it easier for the participants to follow through, what we've done is we broke down the decision tree into its constituent parts, as you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And that will change as we move down the tree as we explain it from top to bottom. So let's start from the top. We initiate by asking if there's more than one model solution for a system. Now, if there's only one solution, we select that model solution as being the best solution for a system, obviously. However, if a system has more than one model solution, what we end up doing is we select the top 2 modeled solutions with the highest total sustainability and resiliency scores. Next slide. Now, if the system has more than one solution, and we've proceeded by taking those top two scoring solutions from a sustainability perspective, then we ask ourselves, we proceed by asking if physical consolidation is one of the top two most sustainable solutions that we've selected. Now, if physical consolidation is not one of the selected model solutions, then we select the non-physical consolidation solution with the lower cost. However, if physical consolidation is one of those selected modeled solutions, we proceed by examining whether it meets either of the following two criteria. First, does physical consolidation cost less than $500,000 in total capital costs? Or does physical consolidation cost less than $60,000 in capital costs per connection? Next slide. Now, if physical consolidation meets either of those criteria, then we select physical consolidation as a solution for the system. However, if physical consolidation does not meet either of those criteria, then we proceed to ask if physical consolidation is less expensive than the second highest sustainable solution. Next slide. Now, if physical consolidation is indeed less expensive than the second highest sustainability solution, we proceed with selecting physical consolidation. However, if physical consolidation is more expensive than the second highest sustainability solution, then we again proceed to ask if the costs of the physical consolidation are comparable or within 25% to the costs of the non-consolidation solution. Next slide, please. Now, if physical consolidation costs are indeed within 25% of the costs of the non-physical consolidation solution, then we select then we go with physical consolidation. However, if the costs of physical consolidation are not within 25%, they exceed that to the costs of the non-physical consolidation solution, then we proceed with selecting the non-physical consolidation alternative option as the cost for the system, as the solution for the system, sorry. Next slide, please. So let's go back again to case studies A and B to see how the implementation, this decision tree implements. Again, system A is a system that has 15 service connections and that has an arsenic violation. Out of the 3 possible modeled solutions, we select the 2 highest scoring solutions. The 2 solutions that have the highest sustainability and resiliency score. And those would be, in this case, physical consolidation at 20 out of 20 and arsenic wellhead treatment at 10.5 out of 20. So, we've selected the 2 most sustainable solutions, or, assessed as being most sustainable solutions. And then since physical consolidation is one of those 2 solutions, we ask if physical criteria meets if physical consolidation meets the criteria of capital costs of less than $500,000 or capital costs per connection of less than $60,000. And while we see that physical consolidation does not meet the first criteria of total capital costs, it does meet the capital cost per connection criteria of $60,000 at about $53,000 and some change. And so this is a system where, according to our decision tree, we select physical consolidation as a solution for the system. Next slide, please. So here, system B is, we have a couple of cases of violations. We have nitrite and fluoride violations, and we have 55 service connections. In this case, we only have two modeled solutions that are available for this system, and so we just go with those, obviously. And since physical consolidation is not an option of those 2 solutions that are available, we just pick the non-physical consolidation option that has a lower 20-year net present worth. So the 20-year costs, over 20-year costs. And the clear winner here obviously is point of use, given its significantly lower price tab at less than under $1 million over 20 years, as opposed to the wellhead treatment alternative at about $6.7 million. Next slide. And so, with this, I've reached the end of my slides. I hope this update was helpful on shedding light on some of the work that is being done, not only on the sustainability and resiliency assessment, but also on how to use the outputs of this assessment in conjunction with the developed cost estimates to select model solutions for water systems. And now I'd like to turn it back to Kristen for what I believe is the Q&A section of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Tara. You guys did a fantastic job giving an update on where we are with the cost assessment model. We do have two questions in from Jonathan Rash. Jonathan, did you want to say your questions out loud, or would you like me to read them? If you raise your hand, I can unmute you. Okay, I will say his questions out loud. And I think, Khalil, they are mostly directed at you. So we've got two questions, and I'll just pause after each. How about that? The first one is, does it make sense to weigh all four of these factors equally? And he's referring to the SRA metrics. I would imagine some factors would be more impactful than others. So maybe speak to the fact that they all have 5 points for the ordinal scores.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan, for that question. Yeah, I mean, weighting is an interesting thing. Theoretically, I'm sure some metrics obviously weigh more. The challenge becomes, given that this is it's a statewide assessment, it's very broad level and not very specific. It becomes an issue. Well, how do these weightings change as you're considering different parts of the state and different systems? And so part of going with an equal weighting is the acknowledgement that at this broad level, it's very hard to accurately represent those weights. And so, as is the case with other multi-criteria assessments, a lot of times the selection of equal weighting reflects the acknowledgement that it's very difficult to come up with a weighting scheme that applies to everything. And so it's a fair broad weighting scheme that really circumvents a lot of those questions that are very hard to answer when you're doing such a broad level assessment.
Thanks, Khalil. We also have another question from Jonathan, and he's saying, if there are two non-physical consolidation solutions with drastically different SRA scores, should costs be the only factor for choosing between the two? It makes the SRA process irrelevant.
This is a very good question again. I guess this is the decision tree is a process that's not fully technical, right? There's some judgment that goes into it, and I think Kristen or Michelle or anyone else who wants to pitch in on this, there was the reasoning we went with this was there were a lot of cases where some solutions that on paper looked very sustainable also were prohibitively very, very expensive. And so while something might be sustainable, if the economics of it don't work, it's very difficult to go with that. So I guess there was a decision to be made here that when we're dealing with non-physical consolidation options, if cost was we went with cost as a guide. I guess there could be a point that can be made about that. I understand.
Khalil, I think it's worth pointing out, and I'll go back, see if I can go back on the slide deck. This example in particular is a good one. I think it's really important as we're looking at these modeled solutions. Again, this is all a model. May not truly reflect what the true costs would be at the community level. But you can see here that the cost per connection between the only two modeled solutions is quite dramatic, in that $18,000 per connection would probably be very unaffordable for that community. So it is really important that we take into account the cost and the affordability of these modeled solutions. So we try to balance between the SRA score and the cost in selecting the best modeled solution for the cost assessment. Just because affordability is such an important piece of the SAFER program, and really an important a driver in decision making at the community level as well. Was there someone else who wanted to make another comment on this question?
Yeah, this is Maureen Kerner from Office of Water Programs at Sac State. I work with Khalil on this project, the sustainability and resiliency assessment. And I think another point is when we were initially running numbers in that, the example we have here for water system B is a little bit of an anomaly. Typically for non-physical consolidation solutions, the total SRA score was a lot more comparable, like a 10.5 versus a 9.5. And given the little bit of an arbitrary nature of some of the scoring in that, we really, like Kristen was saying, it goes to kind of affordability for a community.
This is Michelle. I would like to add to it too, just from a technical standpoint, having co-contaminants oftentimes really makes the treatment very difficult. And I think that's one of the reasons in this particular case that you're seeing POU with a higher sustainability score is because for a small community, doing both fluoride and nitrate wellhead treatment may actually result in the water system falling back into non-compliance because of the complexity of that co-contaminant treatment. So there's a lot of factors.
Thanks, Michelle. We have another question from an anonymous attendee, which was asking, why was 25% selected? And I'm assuming that that is referring to the 25% here. Michelle, maybe you can speak to that.
You know, that is a great question. We tried to use that just as a comparable comparison. Obviously, it could be, you know, other numbers. You know, part of what we see is, you know, as the O&M approaches 30 years, we often see consolidations out pacing the costs of the O&M for treatment. So we wanted to be able to incorporate that somehow, you know, perhaps in later iterations, we can look at other numbers too. But this was just sort of a first estimate to make sure that we were incorporating that somehow.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, let's see, let's go backwards. Tara, we have some questions around the cost model itself that I think are better answered by you. We got an email earlier today from, it's a long email, so let me scroll to where this is. I think it was from CMUA and from Logan Largent, I hope I'm saying that right, from the California Association of Mutual Water Companies. It's a multi-question email, so for everyone with us, bear with us. We're going to be walking through these questions. The first one, it says, we are appreciative of the inclusion of POU and POE devices for systems with fewer than 200 connections, state small water systems and domestic wells. Has any consideration been given to the legal implications, thank you, that may make their use difficult? Tara, did you want to respond?
I do. So we modeled it for systems with less than 200 connections, but that does not mean that it will be the selected solution. As you saw through Khalil's presentation, there can be a lot of reasons to select a different modeled solution. I definitely agree that the more number of connections you have in a system, the less feasible point of use and point of entry becomes. You know, I think because of the requirement to have 100% of customers agree to install those units, it becomes infeasible to try to get that many people to agree, except for in, very small, maybe 25, 50 kind of connection systems, or where there's centralized management, maybe like a mobile home park or, a motel or something like that. So I do think that's an important consideration. We've kind of written that up in the limitations section as something that needs to be considered more in the future. There are also a lot of challenges with implementing point of use and point of entry treatment. A lot of these wells are unchlorinated. The vast majority of the domestic wells and some of the state smalls as well are unchlorinated, and they can have bacteriological growth issues. So you don't want to really put, point of entry treatment, granular activated carbon on a situation like that and create new problems for yourself. There are co-occurring contaminants that could require point of use and point of entry, which obviously is way more complicated. So there are a lot of factors that really will play into the actual implementation of point of use and point of entry that may in some locations make it infeasible. Do you want to add anything to that, Kristen?
No, I think that captured it, unless Michelle wanted to add anything.
No, I think that's fine. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. All right, we have another question asking, you know, on the chart on page 11, referring to the white paper, it indicated that O&M costs are being estimated for systems on the human right to water list, but that is all. It is also noted later that O&M costs were not modeled for at-risk systems or domestic wells and will not be incorporated. O&M costs can be very significant, and Cal Mutuals believe there are that a more intensive evaluation of these potential costs would benefit the analysis, so that costs are not overlooked. Tara, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I will. And then I think maybe Michelle should also add on. So it was a decision made by the board to, at this point, evaluate the capital costs. There will be the other infrastructure needs cost piece that is helping out the at-risk public water systems, and that really should put them in a better position to stay in compliance in the future. And, you know, really that can help with their long-term O&M, just because we're actually making the whole system more sustainable and giving them, you know, tools in the toolbox to keep the system sustainable and running and, you know, in compliance. You know, it is definitely a consideration. It's hugely expensive, but I think the focus really has been on the treatment operations and maintenance expense, which is where we see the higher expenses, and that, you know, is not modeled at this point for the at-risk public water systems. The solutions that were modeled did not include looking at treatment. So that's another major reason that that piece was not modeled. Michelle, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I will. I do think, you know, when you actually look at what we're proposing for at-risk systems, 48% need a second well. So the cost for that, you know, replacement well, 46%, about 30% need pump and motor upgrades, 29% need electrical upgrades, you know, 56% need additional storage. You know, 82% need meters, and 58% need backup power, and there are a few other things. So, and 66% need distribution system replacement upgrades. So we are covering a huge amount, I think, of infrastructure costs to balance that recognition that, you know, the state can't afford to pay for all at-risk water systems. But then when consolidation isn't an option, that there are still sometimes affordability challenges for these small water systems. So we are trying to balance between the two of those. So it's a good question, and we are trying to incorporate it in sort of a slightly different way.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's see. We have a question from Chris Watt. He asks, how will the aquifer risk model be updated and or address areas of the state with limited gamma data where there are large numbers of domestic wells? We do have Emily on the line, who is part of the gamma team. Emily, do you want to address this question?
Yeah. So the water quality model that was used in the state small and domestic well risk assessment is going to be updated yearly, every January, with new water quality data. And additionally, a component of SB 200 directs the water board to coordinate with local agencies to collect all available data that they may have on state smalls and domestic wells, which should increase data coverage.
Thank you, Emily. And you can learn more about our data collection effort on our webpage, and we can share that link with you after the webinar. We do have a full effort underway to collect water quality data on domestic wells and state smalls, working with our county partners. Okay, we have a question from Eric says, for your consideration, a metric on the potential impact of the system being consolidated into, with respect, additional demands on the system, sampling, billing, and repairs to the newly consolidated system. So I think trying to look at the maybe additional costs and other benefits of consolidation trying to be incorporated into the model in the future. Any comments on that? I think that's something we definitely want to strive towards once we have better data. But Michelle, Tara, any comments on that?
I will add that we do keep that other infrastructure needs piece in place if physical consolidation is the modeled solution. So there are a lot of upgrades assumed to be needed and repairs assumed to be needed in many of those systems. Having been involved with physical consolidation, yeah, they generally have a lot of needs and that needs to be addressed. So we did keep that piece of the modeled funding in place for systems that are assumed to be modeled for physical consolidation. So those tanks, the replacement wells, the pipeline replacements, all of that is still budgeted for those systems. So I agree that's a huge issue in many of these systems. They just haven't been properly, or haven't had the funding to be maintained the way a larger system would in many cases.
And I might add to that too, we are also including the connection fees in that. So bringing the system up to usually, the city standards or whatever is appropriate, and then also including the connection fees.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit more there with the way Tara and Michelle described that. As physical consolidations play out in a way that these solutions have been at least initially modeled, more will be learned about those details, both the physical construction needs and the longer term operational aspects of those things, and the costs incurred by both the system being connected and the system that's receiving the connection. And that'll add more insight and understanding to how those play out.
Thank you, Chad. We do have a question in from Cindy Tuck asking if there's going to be a comment period associated with, I think, the new material that we're covering today and the 25% comparison figure in the decision tree. Cindy, yes, there is a comment period. I'll discuss that at the end of the webinar, 2 weeks. And again, we'll do our best to incorporate what we can into this year's assessment, and anything that may take longer to implement, we may need to push off to next year, but we are doing everything we can to accommodate suggested changes this year. We do have an email question that came in too. Is asking for the 200 service connection limit for POU. Just wanted to double check and make sure they heard that right. Are we limiting it to 200 service connections? Wanted to know if that was accurate in the example that was given. Tara?
Yes, that is accurate.
Good.
To keep in compliance with the Title 22 regulations on point of use, point of entry treatment.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have another question from Cindy Tuck. Are the other costs in consolidation, tanks were referenced, for example, just now, part of the 25% comparison in the examples today?
I can speak to that. No, that is not, because it would be applied no matter which of those modeled solutions is selected. It's a layer on top of the selected solution. So whether you select, treatment or you select physical consolidation, we still have that layer of other infrastructure needs. So it is not included in that analysis. It's not on a by system basis either. It's just applied overall to the human right to water systems and overall to the at-risk public water systems, because we don't have enough system specific information to really apply it in a per system basis.
And I might add just to Cindy, what it sounds like maybe some of your concern is. What we practically found as we were looking at these is there is typically a big gap in cost between either consolidation is feasible because it's not too expensive and you're close, or consolidation is really expensive. So there were very few water systems that were sort of in a gray area. So that 25% is really sort of a check there, but the vast majority of them are pretty straightforward into cost dynamics. Just to share that insight and what we saw in the data.
Thank you, Michelle and team. That was a fantastic Q&A session. We got a lot of great questions in via our question queue, our email. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov, or if you're participating via Zoom, please use the question box at the corner of your screen. We're going to move on to the next topic of today's webinar, which is digging into our gap analysis methodology. I'm going to hand things over to Morgan with Pacific Institute. Morgan, you want to introduce yourself, and I'll be advancing the slides for you.
Sure. Hi, Morgan Shimabuku here with Pacific Institute, and we are just leading the heart of the cost assessment model on the funding gap analysis. So go ahead and start. Just as a reminder of where this step fits in overall in the cost assessment model process for human right to water systems. It's the last step in the line down there in the bottom left corner, step 7. The two objectives of the funding gap analysis include refining the estimated funding needed for modeled solutions for human right to water and at-risk systems, and then to also estimate the gap between the funding potentially available for SAFER program and the amount needed for 1 year and 5 years into the future. And hopefully this will help the State Water Board inform broader demands or needs for the SAFER program, as well as help inform the annual funding need that goes into the planning for the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. Next slide. The funding gap analysis itself includes 3 main steps, and I'm going to be going into each of these in more detail in this presentation, but as an overview, the first is determining the estimated funding needs and funding availability. The second would be matching the funding need to the funding programs. And third and final would be actually determining that gap and how much time it will take to meet each of the funding needs. Next slide. So step 1 has sort of 2 parallel tracks. The first on top there begins with receiving the cost assessment output after the sustainability and resilience assessment has modeled the solution that is going to be used in this analysis, and taking that estimated need for both the human right to water and at-risk systems and adding that up to get a total need. Next, there will be a part where we're going to remove the estimated need that already has been addressed, which is basically those water systems on these lists that already have funding agreements with the Division of Financial Assistance, who we've worked with closely on developing this methodology. And also we are trying to account for a percent of the cost or of the need that may be borne by the water systems themselves and local communities themselves, basing that on existing policy that has been presented in the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And then next would be estimating that potential funding need over time, spreading it over 1 to 5 years. And then the bottom track there, we identify potential state and federal funding programs that could potentially meet SAFER program needs. I will note here that the non-state water board funds, whether that be another state fund or a federal funding program, are not directly being incorporated at this time, other than presenting what's out there and could potentially be used. However, it's possible that in the future those could be added into the funding gap analysis in some way. Next, we do determine potential funding program eligibilities to support the modeled solutions, and then estimate how to spread that funding, or how that funding will be spread out over 1 to 5 years. Next slide. So here's a visualization of how we're spreading the funding need over time. And there's a lot going on here. So I encourage you to focus in on year 1, and I'll walk through what these bars all represent. So the red bar here, all the way from the bottom up to the top of the solid red bar, that's the estimated need coming out of the cost assessment model from step 6. And then on top of that, we assume all of these blue bars, they're incorporating the assumption that every year new systems are going to come on to the human rights, water, and at-risk list. So there's going to be new issues that need funding. So we're adding that on as an assumption. And then on top, the hatched little part at the very top is that subtraction of those with existing funding agreements. The green bar then shows what we would be estimating as what we can meet, or what the existing funds can meet in the first year. And then so the difference between that top of the blue down to the top of the green is going to be the unmet year 1 need. And so if you look then to the next year, that unmet year 1 need transfers to the second red column, and that makes up the entirety of that second red column, as well as, again, we add in new potential systems that are coming on to these lists. The green showing how much need we can actually meet in the year, and then again transferring to year 3, unmet year 2 need, and so on and so forth down to year 5. And as this shows our hope, and at this, in an ideal situation, that need over time would be being met more and more by, and the amount coming on would not exceed the amount that we're able to meet each year, therefore reducing over time that gap. Next. So to provide a little more detail on how we estimate the local cost share here. Again, this is only for this gap analysis, and more specifics on a system by system basis of how much each community actually will bear will have to incorporate a lot more detail than this. But the overall idea was that we used the existing Drinking Water State Revolving Fund criteria on eligibility around grants versus loans to estimate how much different community types would potentially be accountable for. As you can see, the type of community on the far left column, the small DAC, SDAC, public K-12 schools that serve these communities would have 0% in our gap analysis estimated local cost share, up to a max amount of $60,000 per connection. And then as you go down, you can see the next group has up to 25% of local cost share expectation, up to a max of $60,000 per connection. And then finally, the large DAC or large DAC and non-DAC systems, for the analysis, we're not considering eligible for grant and principal forgiveness. Next slide. And so for these communities, or for communities that are bearing a percentage in our analysis of the cost of the project, we have put in some assumptions around the interest rates on loans that they may acquire to do this, as well as maximum financing terms. And so you can see those here. So just again, to reiterate, this is only for the gap analysis assumptions. We had to apply some high level, broad assumptions that could be maybe potentially reasonably met. And we worked closely with DFA to try to hone in on these so that they were reasonable and followed existing documentation of how these loan and grant programs work. All right, next slide. So the state water board funds, this list also, DFA helped us to identify the funding programs that can address safer program needs and are being used to address safer program needs. Currently, the fund size is shown there in the middle column, and that's recent as of the 9th of this month. And then the last column shows the projected 5-year cumulative amount. And if you'll notice, the top two, the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, as well as the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, are the only two that we are, for the gap analysis, assuming are going to grow over time. And for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund here, it's just showing principal forgiveness or grant dollars that are growing. However, there is a whole amount of dollars into the future that will be available for loans through this as well, but that's not being shown here because that portion, again, is being, we assume, will be borne by communities as a loan, not as, not for the, by the state. And another thing just to mention here, we show the Water System Administrator Program because that is an important funding program for safer program. However, for the gap analysis, due to data constraints, we weren't able to model administrator costs. And so we aren't going to be incorporating the Water System Administrator Program into the funding gap analysis, but that we did want to show that that is, we acknowledge that that fund is there for safer programs. Next slide. Non-state water board funds, like I said, we looked at both loan and grant programs that could be available for safer projects. And we got, there's detail in the white paper on how much each of these loans and grant programs have provided in the past. When possible, we got just how much they provided for California water systems specifically on an annual basis. And so that can be looked at as a potential available sources to leverage with the state water board funds. However, again, we aren't able at this time to incorporate the actual dollar amounts into the gap analysis. And then across here on the bottom, the 4 agencies listed are just some of the main agencies we found other funding programs through, but there were several others that aren't included here in this slide. Next slide. So step 2 of the funding gap analysis is to match the identified funding need to the identified funding funds that are available. And that process really requires looking at the system types as well as the community types or DAC status and size, and then looking at the grant eligibilities within all of those different state water board programs. So next slide. So here's where we kind of have a high level overview of those quote unquote matches. So the system types there are listed, and those are the system types that were modeled, that received modeled solutions through the cost, earlier steps in the cost assessment. And then the type of community, again, refers to both the size as well as the DAC status of those communities that are eligible. And then the model solution types, those hone in more on the solution types that for the gap analysis, we're going to focus those funding streams for. I'm just noting that because the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund technically is available to fund construction costs and planning costs. But we, for this gap analysis, are focusing more of matching it for these other costs because they are not covered in most of the other funding sources. So that is the matching process. Next step, next slide. And then finally, step 3, which has 2 different approaches. So we're looking at the gap in a few different ways. So this first approach is looking at the funding gap based on safer program priorities and applying those across all state water board funding sources. So the priorities are listed here as tier 1 and tier 2. These are laid out in the fund expenditure plan for the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund from this fiscal year. So the first priorities include primary MCL violations, which cover most human right to water systems. All consolidation, all solutions that were ID'd as where physical consolidation was identified as the preferred model solution for both human right to water and at risk, including state smalls and domestic wells, as well as interim and emergency. So we'll take these priorities and pull out all of the costs for those systems that meet these priorities and see how long with existing funds it will take to cover these priorities over time. And then once the needs of those systems have been met, that's when we layer in these tier 2 priorities, which are secondary MCL violations, which there are a few, like a handful on the human right to water list, state smalls and domestic wells that were not deemed feasible to have physical consolidation as a feasible solution and technical assistance. So, and then we'll layer those in and see how much longer it takes to address these additional system needs. Next slide. So again, the third step approach 2 is going to look more specifically at the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund to better understand really how the target expenditures of this fund will address or could address the existing need over time. So actually go to the next slide. I'll explain with this table. So from the fund expenditure plan, again, from this fiscal year, we pulled out the target expenditures. And in the fund expenditure plan, these are in dollar amounts. And we have translated them into percentages out of the $130 million total amount that the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund is eligible to receive each year. And so using these percentages, we will again apply or categorize all of the solutions by the water system category, which you can see the 3 categories there on the left-hand column, and these 5 different solution types on the top, and apply the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Funds only at these percentages and see how long it takes to address all of the identified issues, or all the identified solutions, I should say, the estimated need with following these targets. Then go to the next slide. Because the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund is uniquely eligible for funding interim water supplies, technical assistance, and direct O&M support, we're additionally going to be removing those planning and construction percentages and spreading them out equally across the other public water system solution categories there. And looking again, just if the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund is the only, as if the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund is addressing all of the interim water supplies and emergency needs, technical assistance needs, and direct O&M support, and seeing how long the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund would take to meet all of those needs. And next slide. So that wraps up the 3 steps, and there is more detail in the paper. However, we're happy to get more feedback on how to clarify and make those steps easier to understand. And then I did want to bring in here the uncertainty in the gap analysis, because that is important when interpreting the results that come out of it. And this is not including any of the uncertainty or assumptions from the cost assessment in this list. We just pulled out the assumptions that contribute the most uncertainty in the gap analysis itself. So to go through these briefly, we assume that there's no change in the estimated funding need for human right to water and at-risk systems. Basically that blue bar that we added across the top each year was the same size, and we have to make an assumption for now that that's going to be the same size, at least for these first 5 years. And then the next assumption is that full state water board fund commitment every single year. Also that estimated funding availability over time remains what we're assuming it is. Estimated local cost share is, again, our assumption around that. And then the estimated DAC and SDAC status, because as many of you probably know, those are considerations that need to sometimes, especially for smaller communities where there's less data, need to take a closer look at the time when these systems are actually working with the State Water Board on a funding agreement. So our assumptions there may not play out. So anyway, that's I think my last slide. So I'll pass it back to Kristen.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that last piece, that we are having to make estimates and assumptions around DAC and SDAC status for communities in order to help us do the gap analysis. So a lot of things will change. Again, really want to emphasize that the full cost assessment model and the results of the gap analysis are really only for budgetary purposes for the fund expenditure plan, and in no way dictates, influences, or will be guiding any decision making at the water board around funding decisions, or should influence communities at the local level around what solutions are best for those communities. And we try to stress that in all of our papers and presentations, and I figured it's worth mentioning again. Just wanted to talk briefly about next steps, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and I encourage all of you to please use the question box to submit questions related to the gap analysis methodology, and if you have any lingering questions from the cost assessment model, slides from earlier. And again, if you're participating via the EPA webcast, please email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. For our cost assessment timeline, which should look familiar to some of you who've participated in previous webinars, we are at the very end of the yellow phase here. We just are concluding our webinar update. Next steps, we are literally weeks away from finalizing our preliminary results for the cost assessment model and gap analysis for the fund expenditure plan. The contract that we have with all the amazing people who are on this call with us today does conclude at the end of March. We do have a feedback period associated with the content that we've covered today, and we are hoping to be able to incorporate some of that feedback into the final results of our cost assessment model and gap analysis work. It just depends on how heavy a lift it might be. And I'll go over the timeline there, but really what we're trying to do is finish things up for the 2021 needs assessment. Things are being wrapped up now. And we're very excited to share the final results with everybody in March. So these are the next steps. If you would like to provide additional feedback to us on what you've heard today, we do have the white paper that's posted online on our needs assessment website. You can email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov with an email with any comments or suggestions or feedback. We are asking that you do that by March 12th. Again, we will do everything that we can to respond and see if we can incorporate suggested changes into the 2021 cost assessment. As I've said before, we're at the very end of that contract and with the work being done in order to inform the fund expenditure plan. So there may be stuff that we can accommodate this year and others we would need to see if we can accommodate in next year's cost assessment model. We do have a webinar scheduled for March 25th from 9 to noon to go over and provide a whole overview of all of the results of the needs assessment, which includes the risk assessment, the cost assessment, and the affordability assessment. It will be very high level. We'll be pointing people to the methodology documents where they can dig in to learn more, but we really wanted to provide an opportunity for everyone who's participated throughout this whole process to see what the final results are for the 2021 needs assessment. We do have a registration page that's live now where you can register for that webinar to participate via Zoom. We'll also be live webcasting that event as well if you want to continue to participate via the webcast instead of Zoom. With that, I'm going to open things up to Q&A to go over both the gap analysis methodology and again, any lingering questions on the cost assessment. I see we've got a few questions that have come in. Let's see, we have when prioritizing, this is from Cindy Tuck, when prioritizing the SB 200 funding, how does staff look at the human right to water systems and at-risk systems? How does staff look at SB 200 funding priorities for human right to water systems? I think we covered a little bit of that, Cindy, and how we prioritize funding in some of those programs, but maybe that's a question for Jasmine, Jasmine with DFA, if you want to talk about that.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Jasmine Oaxaca from the Division of Financial Assistance. Yeah, thanks, Cindy, for your question. I want to say that, oh, sorry, the question, I was looking at the question and then it disappeared. So we are prioritizing the human right to water systems in our funding, generally speaking. These tend to be the, as you know, these are the ones with the violations. So that falls into our category A of projects where there's an immediate health concern. We're also looking at our typical categories B and C as well. And those, sorry, and then after that, we would consider, the potentially at-risk systems. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Jasmine. I hope that answered your question, Cindy. If not, feel free to enter in a follow-up question.
And Cindy, this is Michelle. I might just add a little bit. I think we threw poor Jasmine off there by bringing this other slide up. But, I just wanted to clarify here on that the at-risk systems are tier 2 priority. So we would be looking at the human right to water issues first in this approach to make sure that those are captured. As Jasmine said, those are our A through C priorities, which are sort of health-based violations.
And then I just also wanted to add to that consolidations are priority, as stated in our adopted fund expenditure plan as well.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Thanks, Jasmine. All right, we have another question in. It's a little long, so just bear with me as I read it out loud. From Danielle, I had a question regarding the estimate of 47 unique systems added annually for years 1 through 5 for human right to water systems. Those are that blue bar that Morgan shared earlier. Recognizing that this is not necessarily a linear process, however, wouldn't the 47 systems have already been included in the at-risk system designation? Is it possible that this could lead to potentially a double counting of systems, especially when consolidations of the at-risk systems would potentially reduce the number of systems? I think understanding where these systems come from is important, as 47 systems over 5 years will be 235 new systems, essentially doubling the existing 300 plus systems currently on the human right to water list. And I think, and I will address this one, Morgan, if that's helpful. One of the challenges that we had, Danielle, in trying to conservatively estimate the number of systems that may be coming onto the list each year is that we just didn't have any historical data to go on in terms of, we're only starting to track at-risk systems now. And as much as we really hope that our at-risk designation, that our list of systems would capture all of those, perhaps that would then come onto the human right to water, really, doing its job and predicting those that are at risk. There is probably a good case where a number of the systems that come onto the human right to water list maybe weren't captured in the at-risk list. We looked at the historical data over the last 3 years, and we think that 47 unique systems is pretty conservative and in line, honestly, with the trends that we've seen in systems that are coming out of compliance each year. So we want to improve that estimate over time, especially as we start collecting and tracking more data around systems on the at-risk list, and then the systems that are coming onto the human right to water list. And I know this is a long response, but I also want to add that, beginning in March, or starting in March at some time, we are transitioning to the expanded human right to water criteria for those who participated in the December risk assessment webinar and have looked at that white paper associated with it. We had proposed expanding the human right to water list criteria to capture additional metrics like E. coli violations, treatment technique violations associated with an MCL, and monitoring and reporting violations. So there's additional expanded criteria, which it's difficult for us to say how many new systems annually may be captured with that new criteria, since we haven't been really tracking that so far. So again, that's why we think that 47 number is pretty conservative, but we'll definitely be modifying it as we do this gap analysis every year with actual data. So I hope that answered your question. If not, please feel free to provide another question in the question box. Michelle, was there anything else you wanted to add, or did I cover that?
Yeah, no, I think you did well. I guess only 2 points. I mean, and I understand what you're saying about the double counting, and I do think we should look at that. But we also anticipate, hexavalent chromium will be coming out soon. We have PFAS. There are a number of sort of emerging contaminants that are on the horizon, at least. And so, unfortunately, I think during this first 5-year time that we're looking at, that won't necessarily, there will be a lot of new issues that sort of come up that maybe aren't captured entirely. And then the other thing I would say is, Kristen mentioned monitoring and reporting and being on the expanded human right to water list. And I just want to be clear for those of you that haven't been following this process, that is our sort of our most egregious monitoring and reporting violations, to the point where we question whether or not we actually know the quality of their data. So it isn't, one missing monitoring and reporting violation, it's multiple over a certain period of time. Not that one missing monitoring and reporting violation is okay, but just to be clear that that it's not the entire universe of those.
Thanks, Michelle. We have a comment and a question from Logan. Again, another long one. I'll do my best to maybe break it up and try to answer this. Part of the gap analysis is to highlight opportunities where non-water board funding or federal grant funding could assist or be leveraged, I think, in addition to the water board funding to help those. Generally, those sources will present issues because of unrecognized taxes and status of mutuals and won't affect the program's reach in this area. By and large, small at-risk systems lack financial, managerial, and technical resources to develop and submit grant proposals, and TA programs are in place to assist are not available to systems in all regions of the state. Is there any consideration of adding funding to facilitate grant writing or to develop alternative pathways for small systems to access needed resources? I think I'll just say, and then maybe turn it over to Jasmine. There are significant, technical assistant resources that are available to help small systems in particular access funding and resources needed to help address their challenges. And Jasmine, do you want to chime in on that a little bit more?
Sure, that's correct. And perhaps I can add into the chat box the link to get more information on our website as far as the technical assistance programs, if that's helpful. But we do offer assistance with various needs of water systems, and we have TA providers across the state to help with that.
right? I know that our CAC has a new circuit rider program to really help those systems. I think we really want to emphasize too that we are under the SAFER program making TA available to those at-risk systems, especially where consolidation is not an option. So I hope, Logan, I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure I grasp the regions where some systems may not be able to get assistance. So maybe you can clarify that in another question, or you can connect with us via email or offline. Okay, we have a question in from Emily. She says, I realize we're still analyzing the gaps and have a number of challenges in understanding the data, but I'm trying to understand what some of this means in dollars. In the slide title, methodology for the 5-year funding estimate, that's the one with the bars. The unmet need is highlighted, but it doesn't state approximate numbers. Can you provide those estimate in dollars in addition to the bar chart? Emily, we will be releasing the results of the gap analysis in March towards the end of the month, which will have the actual dollar signs. This is really just providing an overview of the methodology that's going to be deployed in order to calculate those numbers. So we don't have the results to share with you yet. And then there's a mention about we're expanding the human right to water criteria, and is this being captured? Again, we are being very conservative in the 47 system estimate. It is meant to capture some of those, but we don't anticipate it's probably the right number. We're going to be adjusting it as we collect more data. But it does, the human right to water systems that do meet that expanded criteria, their costs are calculated in the overall cost assessment and were included. So it will be captured there, and we'll be able to better predict future demand, I think, at least after 1 year of collecting this data. So Emily, I hope that answers your question. We did get an email earlier from Logan, and I'm gonna read out loud some of those questions. Let's see here. I have, the white paper explains that the cost analysis assumes interim solution costs for human right to water non-DAC systems will be paid for by the system. This is problematic because there are many cases where part of a service area may contain disadvantaged areas, but it is not reflected in the overall evaluation, and costs may be difficult to meet with no assistance as a result. A less binary assumption should be made. Furthermore, because it is a mandated action, funding should be available. Systems may not be considered disadvantaged, but may have funds allocated or tied up in other proceedings. Morgan, did you want to discuss this briefly?
Sure, I'll just reiterate the local cost share estimates here are strictly based on the existing funding eligibility criteria as set out in the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. But again, they're only being used in the gap analysis to estimate the potential local cost share. And, we absolutely, the board recognizes that on a case-by-case basis, that when actual funding agreements are being worked out, there's going to be need to be a more detailed analysis of each community's ability to pay. So I don't know if anyone wanted to add on that, but that was sort of my initial thought.
Thanks. Yeah, this is, again, a lot of what's in here is really assumptions that we're making in order for us to be able to conduct the gap analysis. Really, if a system is on the human right to water list, needs assistance, they are encouraged to connect with DFA or with the Division of Drinking Water's engagement units, the Southern or Northern engagement unit, and they can help that system and that community start exploring what options are available and what funding assistance may be available. And they take, affordability challenges are considered when funding agreements are made. Another question from Logan says, in the discussion of local cost sharing, the chart on page 13 of the white paper shows cost per connection ranging from $4,500 for small SDAC systems and up to $11,250 for small DAC systems. These costs would likely be infeasible for mutual water companies that may not be able to effectively utilize grants due to the tax implications. Local cost sharing elimination should be considered for more systems. Morgan, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I guess I was a little bit confused here. Just the numbers caught me. So what I see in the gap analysis that the local cost share is up to 45,000 to 60,000 per connection. But I hear what you're saying. Also, your concern is that for specific types of public water systems, mutual water companies, this may not be able to use any grants because of the tax implications. And again, we had to make some very high level broad assumptions for this analysis. And we're not able to get down into the details of exactly every system's situation. I don't know if anyone wanted to speak to Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund in particular, if that is able to provide grants, but I don't know. I guess if a mutual water company, I don't know the tax implications for accepting a grant, but maybe that's something we can incorporate in the future, is looking more specifically at which systems are able to accept a grant versus not.
This is Michelle, and I will just jump in a little bit here. I mean, from the standpoint of tax implications, we are aware that that is an issue for some of our DAC systems that are privately owned, or some of the mutuals as well, depending on their structure, that particularly those that are not nonprofits. And so I think that that is both a bigger legislative issue that needs to be addressed, and also maybe a discussion for the policy, the fund expenditure policy and plan. Like they said, in this analysis, we're really honing in on what our current policy and plans are, using those as the basis of our assumption. So if you're looking to make changes to those fundamental assumptions, I think the place for that is really at the fund expenditure plan and policy level. And then when we come back and do revisions of the needs assessment, we will change those assumptions based on those other changes that would occur.
Thanks, Michelle. We have a question that's just come in from Ryan Jensen with the Community Water Center, asking if we could explain how the costs for effective outreach and engagement of impacted communities will be included in the cost estimates, and how the cost incorporated for resident, and how will this cost be incorporated for residents, not public water systems? I think maybe relating to local cost share. Maybe Tara, you could speak to the cost model and cost estimates related to community outreach and engagement.
Yeah, we did assume some money, especially in the first year, for community outreach and engagement, and then also some funds as well in ongoing years, just because there's obviously a transition of community members, domestic well owners, etc., that you need to keep reaching out to these folks to let them know what the issues are with their water and why, something's being done. So I think that's an area where we could definitely use more information and data. There were very limited numbers of reports to pull from in order to put a cost assumption in there. And I do think that's an area that definitely going forward, folks like Community Water Center and self-help, and a lot of the folks kind of working across the state on some of these first projects that are pilots, or, first rollouts of point of use, point of entry, and interim solutions for domestic wells and state smalls, really will inform the costs moving forward. And also even just the analytical costs, the time to go get the samples from these wells is a huge factor. So that's definitely an area where better data is needed.
And Tara, can you clarify too whether technical assistance is being modeled for at-risk systems?
Yeah,
And
so for
small
at-risk
domestic
public
well?
water systems, there is kind of a managerial technical assistance component that we put in actually for human right to water and at-risk public water systems. So the assumption there was about $12,000 a year for 5 years. So a total of $60,000 of money to sort of help with their managerial needs to improve their technical financial acumen so that they're ready to stay in compliance, hopefully. I don't know if Michelle wants to add on. She was really crucial in developing those pieces.
Tara, yeah, I was going to share exactly the numbers that you shared, but I would also say that all of sort of those assumptions are in our November 20th cost, long-term cost solutions methodology. And so, we've taken feedback and made some changes, and those will be refined in the final, but just so you know that those are specifically called out in that November white paper.
Thanks. Eric, I hope that answered your question. If not, please feel free to type in another question. I do see that we have some hand raised. I'm sorry if those have been sitting out there for a while. Eric, I see your hand. If you have an additional question, let me know. I'm going to move over to Crystal. Crystal Gonzalez, would you like to unmute yourself? I can allow you to talk.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, everyone. I'm with Clean Water Action, and I just have 2 clarification questions regarding estimating cost share and loan financing. And I just want to note that thank you for kind of saying that these are assumptions being made, and so that's helpful as well. But let's see. Oh yeah, I'm referring to table 2, criteria for local cost share. I guess a question is, if a system can't, and this is for project categories D through F, if a system can't come up with an estimated amount, the amount that's indicated there, and maintain the target rate, would funding go up to meet this need, or would this require action or decision making by the board? Does that make sense? And then my second question has to do with Table 3, the local cost share for loans with repayable financing. We noted that the maximum financing term is 20 years. In the SRF, we see the terms are up to 40. So just kind of interested in understanding that difference. Yeah, thank you.
Jasmine, do you want to cover the first question, and then we can cover the second?
Would it be possible for you to cover the second one first?
Yes. So the second question around the 20% or the 20-year agreement for loans, it's a very conservative year projection, because we are assuming that some of those loans may be non-state water board loans. So yes, some loans, if they are provided by the water board, could have terms that go out to 40 years. However, we wanted to be fairly conservative because we did not want to assume that all of those loans would be provided by the water board. If a community goes out to a private lender or another program, those terms may be lower than 20 years. So trying to be more conservative there. So hopefully that answers your question. For the first question, maybe I can repeat it, and Crystal, you can confirm whether or not this is accurate. You're asking for where we talk about local cost share for those communities that have, I think it was D through F projects. If they're unable to cover the local cost share, maybe their rates are not high enough, what options are available for that community? Can you just verify if that was accurate, or correct me if I'm wrong?
Yes, it's better than I had said it. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Jasmine, are you able to address that?
Thanks, Kristen and Crystal. Yeah, so if that does happen, we do have some discretion to, it would be possible to go to our board if needed. We can also work with you to figure out the best option. So I think some dialogue and discussion could assist the issue.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Crystal, for your questions. I'm going to move over to Eric. Eric has indicated that he would like to ask a question. Eric, I am allowing you to talk. You need to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. My name is Eric Oyana, and I'm on behalf giving comment on behalf of the Community Water Center. We are happy to see that we are closer to providing drinking water solutions to communities at most risk with the development of this cost assessment model. In our experience working with many rural communities, we know that communities often face various factors and contaminants impacting their access to safe and clean drinking water. We would like to see if it is possible to identify how much of these costs are for contaminants like nitrate and 1,2,3-TCP, where there is already a potential responsible party source of funding. Additionally, we would like to know how much of the costs outlined are for resiliency measures that are linked to drought preparedness and might be able to be included in a climate or drought funding source. Furthermore, it is important to identify how much of the costs are linked to private wells and if there is a way to estimate how much of those costs are for low-income communities in areas of high density or near existing systems that we might want to prioritize. Segmenting this information is crucial to establishing funding priorities and funding gaps. And I know there's a few questions in there, so if you could just answer them as best as possible, I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, I think I heard three main questions in there. Would anyone like to start?
I could take a couple of them, maybe not
Thanks,
quite in
Sarah.
order, but for the human right to water systems where there is a specific violation identified, the treatment selection types were all based on the type of contamination. So that is already sort of tied to a type of contamination. So depending on which solution is budgeted through for a, sustainability and resiliency assessment piece, then that funding could be tied back to some extent to the contaminant. It's more complicated in my view for the state smalls and the domestic wells because that's just modeled water quality. So it's not at this point validated by actual water quality testing. And it also becomes a little more complicated because in those cases, we can have multiple contaminants, and some of the multiple contaminants actually could have the same treatment technology. So for example, nitrate and arsenic or nitrate uranium, those types of inorganics actually have point of use identified as the treatment type. And so you'd have to kind of look at apportioning costs based on that, which at this point, it's that we don't have a methodology identified for doing that yet, but for the human right to water systems, I do think that will be an outcome of this process. I don't know if Kristen or Michelle wants to add anything there.
No, I think you covered that well, Tara, unless Michelle, there was anything you wanted to add.
No, I will say in the gap analysis paper, we did reference a little bit the fact that there might be responsible parties for some of this for reimbursement of, so thinking of reimbursement of this funding source, but it is difficult. And as Tara said, we'll sort of outline some of those costs, but what that actually turns out to be, we are not including that as the gap analysis because we want to make sure that the people are served as quickly as possible. And then if some of that can be reimbursed, that would be great. But we didn't want to use that as a source of funding without knowing that it's there at this point.
Exactly. And I think, to your question around, will we be able to parse out potentially the costs around modeled solutions that may be addressing drought issues? My first inclination is I don't think that we'll be able to parse the data that way, but maybe Tara, can you clarify?
I do think we have identified some other infrastructure needs improvements that could qualify potentially in that category. I don't know if Morgan maybe wants to clarify if she's planning to look at that separately. But, you know, if you're drilling a replacement well and you're drilling deeper, you know, that could give you some drought resistance there. Having a tank that could be, you know, providing some extra storage during max day and peak hour demand potentially could be helpful. So we do have costs maybe that could be viewed that way, but I don't know on the funding side, if Morgan wants to add on how that would be viewed.
For this, I'll just add, this is Morgan, that this gap analysis is not planning to explicitly incorporate that, but I think it's a really good point, and I hope that future iterations of this process can do a better job of incorporating those kinds of concerns and issues. So I think that's something that down the line absolutely should be incorporated. But yeah, unfortunately this year we didn't have the data to do a good job of incorporating that.
Thanks, Tara and Morgan. I hope that we answered your questions, Eric. If not, please feel free to raise your hand again or put a question in the question box. We do have 10 minutes remaining, and I want to encourage anyone to, again, submit a question or raise your hand. We are happy to address any of your comments or questions. We'll leave things open for a few more minutes. At this moment, I don't see any hands raised or questions. And perhaps while we give folks an opportunity to respond, I want to invite any of our panelists. Do you have any additional comments that you would like to make based on any of the questions that you've heard today or content that's been covered?
Kristen, I might just say to Eric's point that, you know, the consolidation aspect of it is a big portion of what we're looking at. And you know, a lot of that is drought resiliency as well. And so, you know, Tara's group is developing maps of areas where consolidations, you know, are possible, and also includes sort of domestic wells along those lines where they appear to be, you know, densely packed, and we would consider maybe putting a line out, you know, a pipeline out in that area anyhow. So some of that is being incorporated. I don't know that we'll be able to parse it out this year, but I just wanted to let you know that it is sort of underlying in what we're doing.
Thank you, Michelle. I don't see any additional questions or comments. Again, anyone else on the panel who would like to make a comment?
This is Jasmine from Division of Financial Assistance. I just wanted to remind folks that, you know, as Kristen mentioned, the results of the gap analysis and the larger statewide needs analysis will be incorporated into this coming fiscal year's fund expenditure plan, and it will, you know, weigh into how we will be prioritizing systems for funding. So I just wanted to remind folks of that, and also welcome your comments during our public comment period. I think we'll be shooting for a draft release sometime around the end of May or early June. So that's when you would see that. And then also we would have a workshop, I think, in June around that as well. So just wanted to welcome folks' feedback on that when the time came.
Great. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Jasmine. We really want to see people participate in those workshops and provide recommendations on how to prioritize funding in the FEP. We got one more question in from Eric. He'd like to see an appendix laying out the costs that may be coverable by the litigation and other mitigation programs. Again, we'll see what we can do, Eric. Appreciate your comment on that. Okay. I don't see any more questions. We will stay on the line just in case something does come through. maybe another minute or two, but I want to take the opportunity to just thank everybody so much for joining us today, and especially those who have been part of this process from the beginning. We know we've been hosting a lot of webinar workshops. We appreciate your patience as we try to accommodate the pandemic and doing everything remotely, but we really do appreciate all the comments that come in both during these workshops and afterwards in comment letters and in emails. It's really been invaluable to us as we develop these methodologies. We're excited to release the results of the needs assessment this year and to continue to work with you guys over the years to come to continue to refine these assessments of these models. We know there's a lot of room for improvement, especially as more data becomes available, and as this program matures and we get to really track what's happening with these systems to again refine our work. So please continue to engage with us, follow what we're doing. We really want to be working with everybody to make this a success. Okay, no other additional comments or questions, so I'm going to be closing this down. Again, this webinar recording will be available on our needs assessment and SAFER web pages. Copies of the presentation are available. We need to make them accessible to post on our website. That might take a little bit longer. So if you would like a copy of these slides, you can email us at our safer@waterboards.ca.gov email address, and we can send you a copy immediately. And again, I encourage you to take a look at our white paper and provide comments within the next 2 weeks. So have a fantastic Friday and a great weekend. Thank you.